Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, a blast from the past, Sarah Tribble. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford's Department of Oncology, where her research focuses on advancing cancer treatment and improving patient outcomes. I still remember when I met her at this summer camp a long time ago in middle school, and I just remember being like, she's so cool, and she was older than me, and it's kind of crazy to just be here 15 years later talking about education in our hometown, but I'm really excited for this conversation. How are you doing today?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm good. I also cannot believe that we are having this conversation, you in Japan, me in Oxford, all these years later. I like vaguely remember that summer camp. Like I think it was tennis or some mixed sports. So it's absolutely wild, but I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think, I talked to uh, Mr. Krieger a couple days ago, and it was just a really interesting experience to like reflect back on where we grew up, how we got to where we are today, geographically, even if not anything else. And it's just I think a beautiful process to be able to reflect and piece those pieces together to be like, what was the actual journey to get here? And so I'm just so curious to kind of I feel like when you're younger, you don't really even have the space to ask people questions. At least I didn't feel like I really had the ability to ask people questions about who they really were. I kind of had these like put together ideas, but I didn't really know, I don't think I knew anyone actually that intimately. So I'm really curious to maybe just hear a little bit about your background. Where did you come from? Where were you born? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super fair. I feel like especially because a lot of us didn't even know who we were at that point either. So how are you gonna ask somebody else like who they are and everything?
Mm,
Makes a lot of sense. So I was born in Hayward. I basically lived in the Bay Area most of my life, or like growing up at least. And I actually moved to Roseville, which is like like 2 hours away. It's kind of near Sacramento, for a couple years when I was like first and second grade. And then I moved to Fremont when I was in the third grade. And I went to Forest Park Elementary School. And then I was there throughout everything from Boynton Middle High and then yeah, American. So yeah, I definitely felt like it was I don't know if you like fully grew up in Fremont, like from born and raised the whole way through all the schooling, but I felt like because I came in third grade, I felt a little bit like an outsider for a while because I think a lot of like people in my class growing up all were proper from Fremont. So it was like I had to make new friends like kind of twice going from like to Roseville and then to Fremont. So that was kind of like my like how I ended up in Fremont basically.
yeah.
But yeah,
Uh,
it was a pleasant time, I'd say. Like nothing really like traumatic or bad about like these schools and anything like that, you know.
yeah. I mean, Fremont is such a unique place that I feel like I always want to. I've just been having such a hard time putting into words what it feels like everyone had a shared experience growing up in Fremont. I know there was this movie that came out, DD, or I don't know if you happen to watch it by any chance. But it was
Mhm.
like a really it came out I think a few months ago, but it was a really popular movie that described an Asian American's child's experience growing up in the Bay. I haven't watched it yet, but I heard it was the first time in
Oh,
Fremont particularly. And so,
interesting. That does sound like something we should watch and compare notes, I guess, to our
yeah.
experiences.
I also think a lot about Forest Park in general, and when I think about some of my best educational experiences, I do think it almost starts and ends at Forest Park. I really enjoyed my experience there. I'm curious what your did you like your time in those 6 years? And if so, what do you think it is about Forest Park in specific that made it kind of this magical place?
I think I agree. I have a lot of fond memories from Forest Park. I think it was the fact that I felt like there were so many different like classes or like kind of layers to education there. It wasn't just like you would go to your classroom and then like you would leave. I feel like I have like a very like specific memory of a science lab thing where we went outside onto the big kids' playground. and
Hmm.
like dropped eggs from the top of
Oh
the
yeah,
slide
that
area
yeah,
or whatever. I
yes,
have like a
yes.
very specific memory of that, and like that was supposed to be about gravity or like I don't know things falling and acceleration and stuff. But then I remember like music class, Miss Fullerton.
Oh my
I don't know
God.
if you remember her, but I
Of
loved
course.
music class. The recorder, I like have like I don't know about you,
Yes.
but I have a very like photographic memory sometimes where I can like literally like picture her wearing green and her glasses and her like gray bangs and her little scooter and like she had all these
Oh,
keys that would jangle around. And yeah, just learning hot cross buns on the recorder in her
yes.
class.
Da da da.
Yeah, and then like there would be these like music books that had all the like the songs in them and a bunch of page like pictures and I remember the pages like being very colorful and just like I don't know, I feel like it was a very enriching music class. Like I just walked away with like a sense of like happiness and fulfillment coming from there. And then there was like PE with oh my God,
Mr.
I can't
D.
remember his name.
Or Mr.
Mr.
C, Mr.
D.
C, Mr. C, Mr. C. Mr. D was the science lab.
Yes, Mr. C. I remember him because he was actually the first person to coin my nickname Trouble, as my last name is Tribble. And so I remember in the fourth grade, he used to call me Trouble. And then now it's stuck, and now my Instagram handle is Sarah Tribble, all because of that. So yeah, really everything does lead back to Forest Park or starts in Forest Park.
I think
But
that's
yeah,
a
I
really
feel
good
like
point.
overall,
I mean,
yeah.
the fact that we did have, music, science lab, I'm thinking about computer lab, music, we
Hmm.
had chess, we had art class, like, and the fact that it was a public school still to this day
Hmm.
mind blows me. I mean, I think the how beautiful the lawn was, the playground, it just built this entire community. I don't know if you've been back recently, but they've put up gates all over the place. It actually makes me really sad to see, like,
Okay, that's
entirely.
an interesting point because I haven't been back in like years, but I did go back as an adult, not like I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or so, but when it before the gates. And I remember walking on to like campus or like the playground or whatever, and I was like, this is really open where this would be kind of like a safety concern if like a random creep just were to like could just meander on and just like basically interact with any child. But it's crazy that like growing up, I didn't feel that way at all. I never once felt like, oh, this is too open. I feel like unsafe. I was like, this is the perfect amount of space for us to wander. You knew you weren't supposed to wander past like the big grass area where the baseball field was. Like that was not out of bounds. But I never once felt unsafe, and I feel like that kind of speaks to Fremont too of being a very safe community because going back after living in San Francisco and like everything else that you experience like in undergrad and everything like you start to realize wait this is actually could be the scene of some of a bad story, but it was not the case. So that's kind of interesting that they did put up fences around everything now.
Yeah, some interesting Fremont histories. I believe, from what I was told, I didn't fact check it, but Fremont and American were designed with the same kind of idea, which was a huge lawn to kind of be open in the front with no gates to not make anyone feel like they were being trapped. And
Hmm.
like especially Forest Park, how it's surrounded by all homes, I think it naturally brings this kind of safe environment because it's not on some main road. American is right on the main road, but Forest Park is
Yeah.
kind of like nestled in between all these homes. And so when I saw the gates, I was just like, it gives, as a child, I think, or as anyone, when you enter a place with all gates, it makes you feel like there is a reason to feel unsafe, which completely changes the dynamic of a school, I
Hmm.
think. And so I felt it was, I don't know, it was kind of sad actually in some ways. I was like, the world has created a space now where now we need to start protecting schools to this high of a degree.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the only gate I remember was like where was it 506? Like those classrooms where the sixth graders were on that side. There was like those gates where the bikes were. That kind of makes sense because it's like
Yeah.
one entry, direct entry to the school, and the bikes are stored there, remember? But you're saying like the entire thing is all enclosed in a
No, so
fence
they
now.
have like these big gates now where you can no longer enter where all the tables are. They have like these huge gates. You know where all those tables where you could just like sit
Uh-huh.
or like and then
Yeah.
everyone used to climb the like the rooftop from there. Yeah, they closed it all off so you can't go that way anymore. So
Oh,
and they're just like very
wow.
ominous gates. They're really tall. They're like at least maybe 10 feet. So they're not like small gates. They're like ominous
Yeah.
gates.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point about kind of putting those gates in then like would reinforce a sense of like, oh, we're trapped inside and, you know, not
Yes.
having that freedom. But yeah, like I was saying, I feel like I never once, like I knew where the kind of imaginary boundary of where we were allowed to go. And that was enough. And like, I liked having that, yeah, the freedom to kind of go wherever you wanted during recess or whatever.
Mm.
So that is kind of sad when you put it like that.
You know, I think one of the other really unique Fremont experiences is that there are so many people there. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, where people are first generation immigrants. And so I think it's a really beautiful situation where everyone's trying to figure out what it means to be American, what it means to be, like you said earlier, I thought that was such a beautiful thing you said earlier, where it's like when you don't really even know who you are, how are you supposed to ask someone who they are? And I thought it was a great point, but it's kind of this like everyone's going through this journey of figuring out what their role is in this society. And I think it makes for very unique kind of interactions because when I meet immigrants who lived in Michigan or who are around a lot of other Americans who have grown up here, I think you kind of have you have a sense of, okay, this is what it means to be American. But when you're growing up around a bunch of people who have no idea, you're all just you're stretching for something. What was your experience like? I'm just curious, like throughout your childhood there, what was your journey falling in love with your skin, with your background, with who you are?
That is such a great question. I actually like think about this a lot. Like, I even had a conversation with someone about this over the weekend. But I think for me, I had a very kind of unique perspective coming like to Fremont and growing up there because I am biracial. So I am already like I'm half Indian, half white, but the Indian side is also like my mom is from South Africa. So even though ethnically it's like the same as an Indian from India, it's like a very big cultural difference. So I felt very kind of out of place like when I moved to Fremont, even though I look like skin wise, I have the hair color. I look like I would fit in and I did fit in, but I felt like with all of my Indian friends, and obviously there were a huge Indian population, I still felt kind of different. And I think this because I couldn't speak a language, because like my mom didn't grow up speaking Hindi, so I never spoke it. My grandma kind of spoke it a bit, but yeah, so I didn't feel like I belonged to the Indians, even though I kind of looked like it. So I think for that reason, I tended to go the other way. I tended to identify more with my white side and kind of like put that distance between the rest of like the Indian population just to be like, okay, I am different. I'm going to like kind of not just conform and like kind of embrace that difference. And I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is just like, just with like most cases in America, right, where like people with lighter skin color are going to have more privilege and easier way of getting by in life. So I think that was the other part of it. It was like wanting to embrace the white side and like really emphasize those traits in myself, like for those reasons. But I feel like in general, Fremont was a very like welcoming place, like the people there. So I think I never felt so out of place where like I didn't have a community. Um I really enjoyed having and now that I'm older and I reflect back on it, I'm so happy that I had those friends, because if I had gone, so for example, I said I went to elementary school for 2 years in Roseville, which is like a completely white neighborhood, like very opposite of Indian sorry, of the like Indian dominated Fremont neighborhood. But it was like the very similar, like classic American suburbia. And I was like I think I was like one of two brown people in my class of 30 kids. So that was a very stark contrast. And I feel like if I had not moved back to Fremont and if I had grown up properly in Roseville, I would have had very different, like, not necessarily like a different personality, but like I think I would have embraced different characteristics of my culture. And like I think especially once I went to undergrad and just kind of growing up and like finding my identity and coming into myself, I've noticed that I've started embracing more of my Indian traits now and like that part of my culture. I think it also has to do with the fact that my mom remarried an Indian man and he's like from India. So it's been really like honestly beautiful to watch like the two cultures, like the South African Indian and the Indian Indian kind of like have their similarities and differences and watch that. But I think through him and then just like growing up and realizing that being Indian is like such a beautiful thing. It's like it's such a beautiful culture. It's so rich compared to just me trying to identify with my American white side, where there's really, really not a lot to connect with, you know. So I think in that sense, I'm really glad that I had that environment in Fremont because if I had grown up in Roseville and just kind of rejected all of my Indian culture, I don't think I would feel as I don't know, enriched as a person, I guess, if that makes sense.
Hmm. I feel like it's interesting because a lot of what you said there are really complex things, maybe for a third or fourth grader to really understand. Because one of my really good friend, his dad also has a similar story where his dad grew up in, I forgot where, but in one country in Africa, and his mom grew up in England, and his ancestors were brought up in India, and so he has a very kind of confusing mix of like, what does it mean to be? When do you feel like you developed the language itself to kind of contend with some of these thoughts?
I honestly think it took me till I went to college, like until I was a proper adult, we'll say. Because even through high school, I remember still feeling the same way that I felt as like an elementary school kid of just like wanting to be different and like distinguish myself from the main kind of like Indian population and identify or like really emphasize that I was biracial, that I was half white, and yeah, just embrace those traits over the Indian ones. And I think also another thing was that growing up, I just had no spice tolerance, so I could never eat Indian food, anything spicy at all. I would like when I would go to South Africa, my family would prepare mac and cheese specifically for me because I could never eat any of the food. So I that was kind of another thing that if I would go to somebody's house, like a friend from high school, and they were having like proper Indian food, I would just like I don't know. I definitely felt like there were several aspects of why I felt kind of like an outsider to the Indian culture there. But another thing that I think you touched on earlier about like everybody being immigrants that were just kind of like trying to figure their way out into like how to be an American and like all of that. I think one thing that was kind of like unique as well about my parents is this because my dad was a white American, grew up in America, has like comes from a very American family. So when him and my mom got married, he really tried to push like the American agenda on my mom, and my mom was very receptive to it. So, like the background being, my mom was 20 when she came here from South Africa, and my dad was 32, and it was a green card marriage. So it was just for citizenship, and then they ended up falling in love and having me later. But I think because of that, because she immigrated, like to start a whole new life from scratch for the purpose of becoming an American citizen, like she was very American influence from before I was even born. And so now she sounds completely like me, like us. We have very American sounding accents, but she came here with a very South African accent. And she's like, I look at her now and I'm like, wow, you are a proper American. But I know that a lot of like parents of like friends of ours, and like maybe you felt this way about your family too, like definitely still like have the accents, have a lot of like the traits and character. Like my stepdad, for example, he's lived in the US for 15 or so years, but still it sounds very Indian. Um, has a lot of the same interests, even though he is like also tried to like really embrace the American culture. So I think that was a great point that like everyone's kind of at different stages in their how to be an American, and some people like my parents were just very very American right off the bat. But I did notice that, and like when I would go to my friend's house, like even Zuili's, her parents, when I go to her house, still it's like nothing's changed from when we were kids to now. It's not like they've
Mm.
had some Americanization in that time. So it's very yeah, it's a very interesting point.
Yeah, from like a ethnographic perspective, I feel like Fremont is so fascinating because everyone is trying to balance these like two, okay, I don't want my kids to be too American, but I don't want them to not, so they need to fit in. And everyone's playing
Hmm.
this juggling game of figuring out how do we find the right balance. I would say another core kind of experience in Fremont, and I'm curious if you agree or what yours was like, is the centrality that I think schools play in people's lives. I think because there's so much routine and so much stability and safety, as you mentioned earlier, there is nothing else going on except whatever is happening at these hubs of there's six really big high schools, each with about 2,000 to 3,000 kids, and they all kind of serve as the center of so much of what's happening in people's lives when they live there. All the parents have kids and all the kids go there. There's not a lot of people who are just like bachelors or, they all kind of eventually move out. And I think because of this intensity on this education culture, things start to matter a lot more, and you start to feel like these things matter a lot more than they do. How you do in school, what college you go to, so on and so forth. How do you feel like that kind of pressure cooker may have affected you in your relationship with learning? And if it did it at all, was that your experience?
Yeah, that's so true that you say that because like one thing that both of my parents always agreed and was the reason we actually moved to Fremont in the first place was for the school system. Because when we were leaving Roseville, my parents knew that they wanted to come back to the Bay Area, but because I was born in Hayward, Hayward's school system is very poor. And if I were to have gone to public school, um, near the house I grew up, it would have been a very, very different pathway in life. I think I could have taken. In fact, it's like why I was when I was in kindergarten, my parents put me in private school in Challenger for 1 year before we moved. So I think, yeah, that the school system education is a huge draw for Fremont, and I'm sure like a lot of families moved there for that reason. Mine certainly did. And I think because of that, there was always a kind of like competitive um, atmosphere in all of my kind of schooling. I think more so in Thornton and American, but not competitive in the sense that like people were trying to put other people down. I think it was just knowing that everybody here is smart, or like most, most of the people, in, especially if you're in an honors class or an AP class, like that all these people are like motivated, they're smart, like there was like the people you had that were top of the class, like A plus, straight A plus students. Um, and so I think for that reason, I've always been motivated for school. I've always like felt that that's important and like knew that that's what my parents wanted for me. But at the same time, I feel like I was never that person that was going to be like, I'm going to be the straight A student, like top of my class. And like, I think that kind of bred this like sentiment in myself that like okay, I'm never going to be the best. I'm going to be smart, I'll be like an A and B student, which I was, but I'm never going to be top of the class. And I don't know if this is like maybe one of the negative effects of like growing up in that environment, but I never had like a lot of faith in myself to get into like the top school, so I didn't even apply. When I was applying for undergrad, I applied for mostly state schools and then all the UCs. And my dad really wanted me to go to Berkeley because he went to Berkeley, has been prepping me since I left the womb to go to Berkeley, type of thing. And I had to tell him, Dad, like, I need you to prepare for the real possibility I don't get in, because I like look at the people that are applying for my school and let alone the rest of the state. Like these are really smart, motivated people that have excellent grades, excellent test scores. Like, it's definitely a real possibility. So I ended up getting into Berkeley, which shocked me so much. I genuinely didn't believe I was going to get in. And I didn't choose to go there for that reason of the competitive nature. I chose UCSB because I knew like I was having kind of like struggles with my mental health toward like the end of high school. And so I knew putting myself in an environment where I was like expected to be on like my best academic performance at all times was not going to make me happy. And so I would have rather still have gone to a really good school like UCSB, still a UC, but prioritize, my mental health and being happy. And so I think that kind of mentality might have come from like the fact that everybody in Fremont puts such an emphasis on good education, good schooling. Like this is your top priority. This is everybody's top priority. So that kind of naturally breeds people to be more competitive and not necessarily in a cutthroat way. I mean, there was always rumors from I heard from people at Berkeley where they would like go to the library and take the answer sheets out of books so that nobody else could know and things like that. I don't think it was that bad in Fremont, but I think overall it was mostly a good thing in driving me to prioritize my education. But there's always like that, possibility that it could be a little bit too much, and that's where I think that's how like I ended up choosing my undergrad, and then kind of like that led to the rest of my educational path.
Hmm. I'm actually really excited to get into this question because I've been thinking a lot about passion and a fascination of learning and kind of the awe that exists when learning, I think, is done right. So it seems like you did well in school, you did all the did you feel like you loved learning? Did you feel like you had a intrinsic drive to always want to learn?
Yeah, for sure. I loved learning. I mean, there's obviously classes that you take because they're mandatory and you're not super excited about them. But in general, I really loved learning. I had my favorite subjects, but even in my not favorite subjects, it was really cool to like I think history was probably like one of my least favorite subjects, especially American history. I just found it very boring. But there's definitely still there was never like a resentment to like, oh, I really don't want to go to this class. I really don't want to do this subject or something. I think over in general, um I was very curious. I've always been a very curious person. So like I love just like learning random things or adding to my repertoire. I think that's why I am where I am today. So yeah, definitely have always loved learning. And I don't know if that's just like a me thing or if it's a school
Yeah.
environment thing. I don't know if you felt that way too, but
Yes. I
yeah.
mean, because you mentioned something earlier and I wanted to highlight that because a lot of people do move to Fremont because of the quote unquote good schooling system.
Mhm.
In my definition of a good school, I personally don't think the schools in Fremont are good. Actually might not even argue that they're any better than perhaps the schools in Hayward or any of those schools around. And the reason I say this is because I think based on your family's history, your financial situation, there's a certain trajectory that most students will lead to regardless of where they go to school, just based on the conditions that they come from. And I feel like what ends up happening is all the kids who already have a really high trajectory because their parents are really highly educated and they have a lot of money, like disposable income for classes and tutoring and so on, they all just keep going to Fremont. And so without the schools even having to take up the brunt of any of the work, kids will naturally just do really well. But I think for me, what I define to be a good school is one that like sparks students' interest. So one that
Mhm.
when you leave a class, it doesn't matter whether you left with 5% of the information or 70%. But if you now have the fire to want to go learn more, you can carry that with you for the rest of your life. High school is only 4 years, college is only another 4 years, but your life can potentially be very long. So a
Mhm.
person who learns chemistry for a year, even if they're the best student in the world, you're going to forget that by the time you're 30 or 40. But if you
Mhm.
constantly just have a passion for chemistry and you find a little bit every single time to learn, to observe in the world, to like use it to how you live in your day-to-day life, all of a sudden I'm like, that is a good school that did well, regardless of, so on and so forth. I'm really curious for you, where do you feel like your passion or curiosity came from? What were some of the big questions as a child that you were very driven to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I almost want to say we can take it all the way back to Forest Park because I like you said, I really enjoyed my time there. There was like not a lot of negative memories I have in that place. I think like I remember in sixth grade, were we in the same was that the year we were in the same class?
Oh
Mr.
my, were
Wada's
we
like
in the same?
fifth and sixth
Oh,
grade
no,
class.
you're lying. Were you in Mr.
You and
Wada's
Mr.
class?
Wada for yeah,
Oh,
fifth and sixth.
how did
I
I
knew we had
forget
one
this? We were in
class.
the same class together. No way. For a whole year, we were in this. Oh man. Why did I forget
Yeah.
this? Oh no, that's
It
insane
honestly
to
just
me.
came to me. I was like, I feel like there was a time and it would have had to be in a combo class because you're a year below me. But yeah, I think it was, right?
Oh,
You were Mr.
wow.
Wallace.
Yes, no way.
Okay, wait,
Wow.
this is a tangent. This is a tangent, but a very important one that I feel like I think about a lot, about specifically Mr. Wada's class. Did you feel like in that class there were an abnormal amount of oral presentations we had to give compared to any other class that you've been in. Or did you not have that sentiment?
I definitely felt like we presented a lot. I kind of
Okay,
like
yeah.
that though. I don't know if you didn't like it, but I think I enjoyed that.
Okay, because I have like such specific memories from that class being like, this is an abnormal amount of oral presentations.
Yes.
And I was always very, very shy growing up, very shy and like very introverted. So this was like my worst nightmare was public speaking. And I remember we did it, I think I want to say we must have done once a month or something. I have a memory of doing so many that by the end, I remember it was a I kind of remember your presentation actually. It was
Oh
we were doing
no.
historical figures historical figures. I had Harriet Tubman and we had to like do some sort of like skit or something as part of our oral presentation and like explain their life. But like I remember it was through I feel like you did something with the Backstreet Boys.
No, really? Oh
Yeah.
no, I did
I'm
sing.
walking down the
Yes.
street.
Wow. Why do you
How did that just like
remember this?
I don't know.
I
I don't know.
sang
I
a
have
Green Day song. I'm walking
yeah.
down this road,
Mhm.
the only road that I have ever known. Yeah, it's insane. Oh my, okay, my mind is being blown right now. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, this is what I mean. Like there are some pieces of my memory are missing, but like certain ones are so specific. Like that is a very specific
Wow.
memory for me. But yeah, I just remember like we had 2 days to do all the presentations in the class and it was random. There was no order. So like obviously they took volunteers first. I remember you were one of the first ones. I don't know if you volunteered, but like I was
That's
dreading it because
funny.
I would like my heart would be beating out of my chest like every time it was someone's time to go, and I was just so scared. And I didn't go the first day, and I feel like I remember that was the one that broke me. The Harriet Tubman like presentation broke me. I was like, I went to Mr. Water. I went home to my mom. I cried. I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's just like causing me way too much anxiety and stress. Like, I don't understand the purpose. Like, I did the assignment. Like, can you just ask Mr. Water if I can present to just him? Like, I can't do it anymore. Me and my sixth grade self was like, I'm gonna have a breakdown. And then I went to talk to Mr. Water the next day. I was like in tears, and he's like, why don't you show me the first like 10, 15 seconds of your presentation? And I did. And I remember like it was some act about like saying all aboard for like the Underground Railroad. And he's like, see, like that's so good, Sarah. Like there's no reason to be like, scared or upset. Like I basically just forced me to do it anyway. So that next day I did it and I got it over with. But I just like I hated oral presentations so much from that class. Like throughout the rest of my schooling, they still caused me so much anxiety. And I wonder if it was just because I always hated them and I was always going to be hate them because I was so shy, or if it was Mr. sixth grade class that just there were too many oral presentations. But if you say you like them, but you were always kind of more extroverted, right? Anyway, or did you not
At
feel
that,
that way?
I did enjoy presenting at that point. Yeah. Yeah, there's something that's
Yeah.
very, but it's funny because I think I have the most vivid memories from that class. Okay, I'm gonna throw this out because I actually just recently connected with another person from that class who we both shared the same memory and it was insane. So I'm curious if you remember this moment. There was a time where he asked the class, "What's the one thing you have to do?" And everyone, that's his question. He was like, "What is the one thing in your life that you have to do?" And I remember all the things that we were saying. We were like, "Okay, well, you have to do your homework. You have to go to school." And he was like, "No, no, no." And finally, we were like, "You have to breathe." He's like, "You don't even have to breathe. If you chose not to, you don't have to." And so he's like, "The only thing you have to do is die." And I remember that it was like so mind blowing to me because then I went home and I told my parents that, and they were like, "What are they teaching you at school? Like, you obviously have to do your homework. It's not a choice." But it was just, I mean, it's a very profound thing to tell kids. Like, look, everything you do in your life is a choice. Don't feel like you have to do any of it. It is all a choice. Any feeling that it's some sort of a necessity is a narrative that we're telling ourselves, which is a very profound message. But to kind of just drop it on some 10 and 11-year-olds is wild. Do you remember that by any chance?
I vaguely remember that, but I definitely remember him dropping a lot of philosophical things on us and like us having these really confusing discussions that now I'm like, maybe it was a little bit much for our like fifth, sixth grade brains. But the one I remember was like so specifically, he was asking us a similar question where he's like, "What do we not know?" I don't know if you remember this. And he was like,
Mm,
everyone would be like, "Oh, we don't know," or like, "What do we not know that we like don't know?" And then people were going like, "Oh, the distance of something in the solar system," or
yeah.
like all these like random things. And then finally, it was like, "We don't know." That was the answer. It's like we don't know what we don't know because people were like, "Oh, it's nothing," and then yeah, and it was just saying like we have no
Wow.
idea what we don't know as like humans. And that was also
Huh.
another profound kind of like I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the one I remember more than the dying one, but I do kind of remember that.
No, so interesting that we all kind of have our own, like he used to run a band, Bento.
Yeah,
And,
I
yeah.
had their CD.
Yeah, I mean it was a big deal. Like they performed at school, we all got their signatures. Like man, it's just
Mhm.
he was a really, I think, eccentric teacher, which was pretty cool
Yeah,
looking back at it now.
yeah,
Do you feel like
yeah.
he
I
sparked
definitely
your
feel like
curiosity?
me. I don't know. I think I was more so bringing him up just to be like there were certain teachers I think that stick with you because for different reasons, and let me see all of them were important to how you were shaped and like how you kind of carried out the rest of your education. Like I feel like my third grade teacher was Miss Ordonez. I don't know if you remember
Oh
her.
wow. Yes, I
That
do
was
remember
also a
her.
combo class. I feel like I remember I really, really loved her just for just being really nice. I wrote cursive in that class. And then I was like,
Mhm.
okay, like this is might be what I kind of want out of like a teacher for the rest of my kind of education. And then for fourth grade, I had, oh, it was Miss Higgins, who was like next to Miss
Oh
Branch. And she was
yes.
like the kind of like tougher teacher that was like, I won't take no, nothing for like no excuses and that kind of thing. And I was like, okay, like this is a different type of like way to learn. It's like maybe you don't need to be like kind of babied as much and you can still I still did really well in that class. So yeah, and then Mr. Wada was I felt like the most strict one of all where you had a I feel like I remember hearing even going into that grade because we would get all our schedules like in the summer before and compare and then you would be like, oh, which teacher do you have? And I remember Mr. Wada was like, oh, Mr. Wada's strict. He's going to be the strictest one. And then I feel like I definitely had the most unique experience in that class between the oral presentations, the the philosophical questions that he would put on us and everything. So yeah, I know it was a tangent, but I just felt like
No.
really having like very kind of like specific teachers growing up kind of like was a different is why everybody kind of has a
Yeah.
different experience, and that can definitely shape
Wow.
how much you want to learn or don't want to learn and like the manner in which you learn as well.
Mm. I'm really glad you brought this point up. I feel like I didn't really visualize it until now of where when you step into a classroom, you're with that person for a whole year. Like I
Hmm.
completely forgot. Every day for 6 hours a day, I'm hearing your thoughts, the way you live, the way what you believe about the world manifests inside of your classroom. And you kind of experience learning and the world through the lens of this individual person. So you really become
Hmm.
close to them in sense of like I think students really do understand how a teacher would think over the span. Because in that time, they're not going to be perfect all the time. They're going to, because when in high school or even in college, you interact with your professor or whatever for maybe 2 hours a week, and you don't really get
Hmm.
to see them exist outside of that. When it's 6 hours a day, you're going to see them mad, you're going to see them sad, you're going to see them exist. And so I think the learning is so different because you start modeling them for like, what are they
Hmm.
interested in? Okay, maybe I'm interested in. That's such an interesting point. I never really thought about my elementary school teachers. Like each one of them was a pillar of who I am today. Huh, so interesting.
Yeah, seriously. It's because especially when you start transitioning to junior high and then high school, you have six teachers, right? For like one for each subject that you only interact with like for an hour a day. And then like obviously like then things become more muddled of like you have, I don't know, 30 plus teachers over that time. But when you have like, yeah, I have very specific memories from elementary school of each teacher I had and like what their personality was and like what I learned from that class or what I liked and
Mm.
didn't like. So even yeah, even like Miss Fullerton, like the music teacher, or like this PE teacher, like they all Mr. Humphreys, the safety patrol guy. So like, yeah, I don't know. I thought that
Wow.
was an interesting point.
Pillars in a lot of ways of our lives. So interesting.
Hmm.
I mean, it's so nice to be able to talk about Forest Park. I don't often get to meet a lot of my closest friends I met only after, so I actually don't really get to think about that period of my life enough. And the fact that we had a class together is still blowing my mind. How did I not remember that? I introduced you like I met you at some camp. Like we literally had the same class for one whole year, and I didn't remember that. That's crazy to me. But It's amazing because after we graduated high school, I graduated in 2016, you graduated in 2015. It's been almost a decade, and a lot of life has happened since then. And so
Mhm.
I'm curious to kind of what was your transition from high school, being in Fremont to then being let out into the world to Santa Barbara?
I loved Santa Barbara. I feel like anyone that knows me knew that I was gonna love Santa Barbara just because it's beautiful. It's a way more chill environment. I feel like that's kind of what I wanted for myself is to have, like I said earlier, just not that super competitive. You need to be giving 100% of the time. But I felt like I really when I left and I was applying for colleges, I knew that I wanted to do something science. So I applied for biology for basically everything. I also had an interest in psych, but I think biology was more, I thought was like more general. It could go kind of anywhere in science with the biology degree versus psych is a little bit more of a different direction. So I think it was helpful that I had that idea because I know a lot of people really are lost in like what they want to specialize in. They go in with like undeclared or did they kind of just choose something random. So I think I'm trying to think if there was like a specific class or something from high school or where my interest in science was. I think it was like probably biology with Miss Wheaton at American. That was a good one, and even in middle school. But yeah, basically, I've always had an interest in science, and so once I started my undergrad as a biological sciences in BS degree, my first like your first 2 years, they make you take all of these kind of like fundamental science classes or like fundamental like elements before you even start taking like real science classes, which is like calculus and organic chemistry and physics, like all the things you have to know that a lot of people said were weeder classes because like they're not super fun. They can be hard. And like that's kind of what, you know, shows if you actually really do want to go down this path or if you just chose science just to choose science type of thing. So I was able to, I remember my sophomore year was pretty difficult because I was taking a lot of classes. I think my winter quarter, I had like 6 classes that were all science, including 2 labs. So my GPA suffered a little bit, but I still was like determined to kind of like stick with my path and still found everything like interesting. Physics really surprised me. I didn't think I was going to like physics because I've never been super into math and that kind of dimension, but I actually did really well in calculus and I learned a lot from like all of these classes, including organic chemistry, which everyone says is the worst thing in the world, but it's not. So I think all of those, because I didn't hate anything and because I didn't do terribly at anything, I think that kind of reaffirmed where I was going. And basically until sophomore year, I thought if you had a bio degree, the only place you could go career wise is medical school. And so I kind of just assumed that was the direction I was heading toward, was to becoming a doctor and going to into medicine. But I think by sophomore junior year, I realized that research is a really, big and good option for people that are doing biology or science. And I never joined an academic lab in undergrad, so I only did lab work that was based on my courses. I didn't do anything outside of that. Um, and I could have had the chance to like, so in at least at like UCSB, you could choose between like 2 types of biology. There was MCDB, which is molecular cell and developmental biology, or EEMB, which is like ecology and evolutionary and marine biology. So I ended up taking classes from both, and I always kind of liked the molecular cell bio better, and I could have chosen to like change my major and specialize more into those kinds of classes, but I kept it very general because I genuinely enjoyed both. So I ended up graduating with just general biological sciences degree, but I always kind of knew that was the direction that I wanted to go. Um, and then I basically went straight into research after undergrad. I had a summer of traveling and figuring out what it is to be 21 with your freshly graduated degree and entering the workforce and becoming a real adult. And I basically kind of got lucky in this so it was actually like the summer before I graduated. I had this internship at a biotech company in Berkeley. And it was like a immuno-oncology startup, like tiny. It was like 6 people when I joined. And it was something that I found through connections because I was looking for internships, but it's obviously notoriously difficult in the Bay Area, even though there's a lot of companies, but especially like not being an academic lab and not really like having a sense of specifically what I wanted to do. This opportunity kind of just came to me because my mom like knew someone who knew someone type of thing. And so I had a summer internship at the company. When I graduated, I was like, oh crap, I have to actually figure out where I'm going to fit in the world now, like what job I'm going to take. I thought I would just reach out to the same company and ask, like, you guys need a full-time employee. I'm happy to join. They were like, we would love to have you back. And I went back in September, a few months after graduating, and I was there for 4 years. So it worked out really well. Like my kind of journey throughout, it was very smooth. I didn't have a lot of moments where I was like lost or didn't know what kind of direction I wanted to go. I know that not everybody has that experience, so I do feel very grateful for that. Um, and I think being at my company the first 2 years, definitely the first year, maybe into the second year, I for sure had imposter syndrome. I think just because like I said, no academic lab experience. I barely knew how to pipette when I joined the company. But that being said, I think I learned so much and I like not only just about science, but being an adult and like having a job and what it's like to be in a business and be employed and then moving out of your parents' house and all of that. So by the time I was in my third year at the company, I always kind of knew I wanted to go back to get my PhD. I realized from being in the company because I was the only person without a PhD. I was also the youngest one. Everyone was older and married with kids. So it was a very different kind of vibe than I was used to from undergrad. And like maybe for like if I were to gone to a big company, I'm sure I would have had like a lot of people in the same like life stage as me. But because of that, I think that's what fed into the imposter syndrome. I was like, oh, I have to go back to get my PhD. Like I have to become like all of these people are experts in their field type of thing. Like these people all know what they're talking about. They bring something to the table. But because I was just this little fresh fresh out of college, like barely knew anything. I think that's where I first kind of had the idea. I think it's also kind of a um, generally acknowledged in biotech specifically that if you want to be taken seriously and you want to climb the corporate ladder, you want to get to like a higher stage of your career, you do need to have a PhD. So that's where I got the idea. And then I got really into the idea of going back to school, studying something that I'm really, really interested in, I have a passion for, and just becoming an expert in that like area. And I thought that part, so that's kind of like ties in back to what you're saying earlier about like the passion for learning that I've kind of always had. I think at first it started as a more I have to do this because it's like almost like a business kind of decision. But then I got really excited by the idea of the learning part of it. And so
Mm.
then I applied at that time and now I'm here doing it 1 year in. So that's kind of the whole journey of where it's been
A
how I
fast,
got
a
here.
5 minute summary. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
would you say there was a specific reason you were drawn towards oncology? So maybe could you explain first what oncology is? It's too many letters for me to know what it is. I'm gonna need you to explain quickly. I know it has something to do with cancer, but yeah,
Yes.
I'm curious to know a little bit more about what oncology is and then what drew you towards that specifically.
Yeah, for sure. So oncology is, like you said, it's very simple when you break down to it. It's just the study of cancer, like the science of cancer. It's like a very big umbrella term that could be about the biology of cancer or the treatment of cancer. There's a lot of things that you can do with oncology, and that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to go into it. So I think the main reason being like I said, when I left undergrad, I didn't have a very specific idea of what I wanted to go into. And this internship opportunity just kind of like arose and I took it. And the company I was at was an immuno-oncology company. And so that basically means that There's also a therapeutics company. So it being focused on the treatment of cancer, but through the immune system, like through immunotherapy, rather than it being like a drug or some some areas are like what I'm doing now is more focused on the biology. But where I came from, where it started, was a therapy company focused on the immunology of cancer. And I found this very fascinating because the golden standard for cancer is and has always been chemotherapy and radiation, which are both very toxic to the body in general. And I guess it's worth explaining kind of how that works because that's similar to or like related to what I do now. So essentially how chemotherapy works, and I genuinely did not know this until I started my PhD. So even though I worked in immuno-oncology for 4 years, I didn't actually know like how the main treatment of cancer like actually works on a biological level. So basically chemotherapy drugs, they sound like they're this highly toxic chemical that, is being put into your body and it's just going to destroy it. And it's just like, I don't know, that's why you see all these like negative side effects. You think it's just this horrible thing for you. But it's not just some like random, like terrible chemical that somebody discovered. Essentially, so cancer cells become cancer cells when normal cells are dividing and replicating at an abnormal rate. So they like either acquire mutations or there's environmental factors, but essentially there's like certain genes that are regulated very tightly in a normal cell that allows for growth and replication, division, everything at a normal controlled rate. But when any one of these factors like gets mutated, goes missing, so and so, that results in a cell that's just uncontrollably dividing. And then that becomes clonal expansion, which basically means one cell becomes a whole mass of cells that have the same kind of mutation, the same thing. And that's what results in a tumor is just is a whole mass of cells that are all messed up, basically. And then those cells can invade. And so cells are supposed to grow in a monolayer, but once they become a mass, they can do something called the EMT, which is epithelial to mesenchymal transition, which is where they start going past the layer that they're supposed to go. And that's when you get things like invading the bloodstream or going to other parts of the body. So that's when you see people develop metastases. Somebody that had cervical cancer can now have lung metastases because it expanded. So that's when cancer is like getting into those like stage 3, stage 4, like really bad life expectancies because it's just like basically getting to the point beyond control. And so, how chemotherapy works is it's usually a drug or a chemical that is targeted at dividing cells. And if you think about it, it makes sense because all cells in the body are going to be dividing, but the ones that are going to be dividing the most are going to be cancer cells. And so, this is why you see when you get chemotherapy that patients have all of these kind of like negative effects and like you lose your hair or you have like other kind of symptoms in your normal cells because even though you're preferentially killing cancer cells, you're still going to also be killing normal cells because every cell has to divide,
Mm.
not just a cancer cell. And so it works by interrupting like DNA replication for like certain ones. So the drug I work with right now the most is called CPT or camptothecin. It's mostly used in the treatment of like colorectal cancer patients. And it essentially traps this enzyme. It's called TOP1, topoisomerase 1. That's a very critical enzyme in DNA replication and transcription in a cell. And it basically traps it on the DNA so that it cannot like remove itself in a normal way that would be just like kind of going through the motions of like regular DNA replication. So when it traps it on the cell, it kind of creates a roadblock to replication. And that is going to cause like DNA damage. And DNA damage eventually leads to breakage of your DNA and your chromosome instability, genome instability, and then eventually cell death. So that is how like the mechanism of a lot of chemotherapy agents work. It's really just like not this like crazy horrifying thing that you may think it is. It really is just like something that's going into your cells and stopping or causing issues for DNA replication
Mm.
and cell division. And so that's kind of just one small branch of like cancer therapy is the DNA damage area. So that's like what I do now. But the
Wow.
what I still stand by is like the that immunotherapy is the future because, like I said, with chemotherapy, even though it's effective in some cases, it's not effective in all cases. There's a lot of resistance mechanisms, and it's also killing healthy cells. So the goal behind immunotherapy is essentially using your immune system to fight cancer rather than a drug that's going to target all cells. It's basically kind of like turning your immune system back on because your immune system is off like in cancer cases because that's how cells are able to like get through these checkpoints and divide uncontrollably because your immune system is not surveilling it. And the idea behind my previous company and all other kind of immunotherapies is just to turn the immune system back on so that you're not really introducing something foreign. Let's say you're using your own cells to fight specifically cancer cells so that it limits the kind of off target effects. And I think that's a really hot field right now and has been for the last like decade or so in oncology. And that's what I've found very, very fascinating. And that's why I loved my job and loved the research. And that's why I stayed there for so long. And so anyway, this all of this is why I developed my passion. I think it's extremely fascinating. I think it's very important. I think cancer is one of the leading causes of death worldwide, and I think everybody knows somebody or knows somebody that knows somebody that has passed away. My nanny passed away when I was a freshman in college from cervical cancer, and I was really close to her, so that was a very big impact on why I wanted to pursue this research. I didn't know my grandparents on my dad's side because they passed before I was born, but they both passed from cancer. So three out of four of my grandparents passed from cancer. So and I know so many people either have a loved one or know somebody that it's just everywhere. And I remember kind of like growing up, and I know a lot of people still think this like, when is there going to be a cure for cancer? Why is there not a cure for cancer? Like this is kind of the reason why there's never going to be a cure, like in air quotes, in the sense that there's never going to be like one kind of like vaccine or medicine that's going to like cure every single person's cancer because there's so many ways cancer can arise, different types, different aggressive like levels. So I think that's why it's so important to have different perspectives on like oncology, cancer therapy. So like I said, I was doing immunotherapy before. Now I'm doing more of the biology of cancer and I'm studying DNA damage in my PhD. And that's like kind of what I was explaining with the enzymes and DNA replication. Yeah, so it's very important in my opinion that kind of we tackle the problem from all sides so that we can maximize the amount of people we can reach with therapy and save
Mm,
as many lives as possible.
wow. I feel like I could hear you, I could listen to you talk about this for a long time because honestly, I know so little about it and it's all such new information to me. I have a few
Mm-hmm.
questions. So
Yes.
the first one that came up to me is in your lifetime, what do you hypothesize? Let's say we're able to make it until 2080. That sounds pretty crazy. Can we make it till there? That's how many, that's 56 years from now. We're about 25. It's about 81. We could definitely do that. All right. So 20, what did I say? 2080? Yeah. Okay. What do you
Yes,
think? Where do
maybe.
you think we will be with cancer about 2080?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's really hard to say because I mean, we're in the point of scientific research where things are evolving so rapidly, like exponentially better compared to like a few decades ago. People were still mouth pipetting and figuring out cell culture. I'm actually reading. I don't know if you've heard about HeLa cells, but there's a book about. So HeLa cells are like the most important type of cell that has been used in scientific research in general, like not just cancer research. This is how they found certain vaccines, like polio and just so many, like a plethora of things. And they came from this patient who came in with cervical cancer, and her name was Henrietta Lacks. And so that's where HeLa comes from. It's the HeLa is for her name. And it's become an ethical, this is like a little bit of a tangent, but it's become an ethical debate because they were technically harvested without her consent. And now they've led to so many lives, like over decades being saved by all of this like amazing research that was able to happen because there's always been a difficulty in growing cells in a dish because obviously you cannot test everything that you want to test on a live person. So you need to use live cells in a lab context to test your drugs and your hypotheses and everything. And that was not really possible. It was a huge struggle until Henrietta Lacks and her cells came along and revolutionized science and cell culture. And so this was all happening in the like 40s, I want to say. So still less than 100 years ago, people weren't even able to do any experiments at all. And now, fast forward to, yeah, 2024, HeLa cells have been like pretty much every lab in the world probably has a vial of HeLa cells that are stored. And now it's opened the doors for like so many other types of cells, not only cancer cells, but everything that has allowed for people to advance so much with scientific research, and things have been so much faster and like high throughput. So it's hard to say because what's going to happen 50 years from now? Because 50 years ago, we were just getting somewhere to be able to have like reproducible data. Um, but now that it's revolutionized so much, and if I can picture it on a more exponential curve, it could really go anywhere, I'd say. I think every day there's papers being published that there's a new discovery that's, one specific pathway leads to this effect in this cell. And I think that was something that was difficult for me to reconcile with when I first started my PhD, because coming from a therapeutics company, it's very goal oriented of like, okay, we want to develop a therapy that's going to cure this type of cancer or like these types of cancers and this way. And all of the money goes into that kind of like project. And in academia, and like you're focusing on one very, very small piece of the puzzle where you're like, I'm like that enzyme I talked about, top one, and how it's like, gets trapped on DNA, how it gets cleared from the nucleus, and its mechanism is such a small little piece that I almost felt like when I started, like, am I really doing something? Like, and by studying this
Mm.
and like looking into this more, is it really going to make a difference? But when you take a step back, you realize that everybody's in oncology is doing their little project, their little piece, and they're publishing a paper about this one thing that's adding to the giant repertoire of knowledge we have about oncology. That all does matter. It's like one of those things where it's like an ant in a colony alone is
Hmm.
not really doing much, but when it all comes together. So I think, yeah, I have a lot of faith that in the next 50 years, all of these pieces are going to like really have an additive effect. And especially with therapy companies, like the more business side, millions, billions of dollars are going to these companies, not only startups, but like big pharma, like Gilead, for example. There's a lot of investment in these things to revolutionize, like not only the technology, but how we treat things.
Mm.
Like, yeah, with like immunotherapy, for example, was like never even really a thing more than a couple decades ago, and now a lot of people are working on immunotherapy. So
Mm.
can't say no exactly, but I have a lot of faith that it's going to get just better and better the more that more people
Yeah.
work on it, the more we invest our time into it.
I think the way you laid out what academic research looks like, where it's this kind of trust that you're putting in on the people who come after us to continue the work that we have done to keep, I guess, developing a deeper understanding of the world. Is just like that's when knowledge and education became so much more interesting to me when I was like, whoa, this is like a shared project that connects all humans who have lived before us and who will come after us. And the way we communicate with each other is through what we have found and our ability to then write it down or capture it in some way so that people in the future can learn from that. I
Yeah.
have a question for you because I ask, this is something that always interests me about people who work in fields that I think can sometimes be heavy. When
Mm-hmm.
you do a lot of this work in cancer, have you found a way to kind of abstract it so they're just like these like themes, or do you ever, as you're working on it, feel the kind of existential pull or feel of like what it means to actually work in cancer or work with cancer?
Yeah, that is a really great question because I've talked to my lab mate about this. Like, pretty recently because when you're in the lab, it's just cells in a dish. It's just a chemical in a freezer. It's just an experiment you have to get done for your PhD, and your supervisor expects data like this. So it does become very abstract and kind of separated from like the reality of what the end goal is. And I think this is kind of tying into what I was saying, like starting my PhD and just focusing on this like one really tiny, like it's almost like you have blinders on to kind of like the big picture because you're so
Mm,
focused on this one thing, you
mm,
forget, or it's easy to forget like why you're doing it. And I actually didn't think I liked academia because when I first started, people were like, "Oh, do you like it? Like, do you see yourself staying in academic, or do you see yourself going back to industry?" I think that's a big question a lot of people like face when they are in academia. And initially, my gut reaction was like, "Oh, I'm gonna go back to industry." I just felt like I was like doing more for oncology for the treatment because when you're working on a therapy, you have to think more about like, okay, where is this drug in the development pipeline? Like, what's the next step we need to do to get to clinical trials? Like when we can actually test it on patients, and then, you know, it was really amazing being in that company because I joined when it was just in the very discovery early stages, and we had to like kind of watch this product go and think about these things about, okay, we need to hire a translational scientist now because it's very difficult to make a lot of strong conclusions when you're doing only in vitro data on cells and then you move it to in vivo in mice. But then even from mice to you have to then test in non-human primates and then you can move to humans. So there's a lot of like a lot of these steps you have to think about when you're developing a therapy, and it really is all the end goal is the patient, is humans, and that's why we're there. But yeah, in academia, it's a lot harder because you don't ever really have to think about that. You don't have to think about how is my research going to translate. And so my friend in my lab and I were having this exact conversation where he's like, sometimes I find it difficult to feel like what I'm doing is important, and like maybe that might be like a new career change for me is to go into translational science because that is the specific branch where you are bridging the gap between what's happening in a lab versus like getting clinical patient data and translating the two. And so yeah, it's definitely hard. It's definitely abstract, but that's another reason why I feel like it's easier because then I think it's not as much pressure on, this moral global pressure of like, oh, I'm doing this and I have to do this well because otherwise, like, patients are going to suffer the consequences. It's just like, oh, I have to do this well because it's my experiment and I want it to succeed. I want to discover things so I I see pros and cons to it. But I think I really enjoyed reading this book that I mentioned that about it's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. They even made it a HBO documentary starring Oprah Winfrey, which I
mm,
did not know. I want to watch after I finish reading, but I really have enjoyed reading it because it talks about her life, who she was as a person, and it talks about her whole family and like with the ethical debate, it was like a big issue because, like I said, every lab company has these cells, has made billions of revenue off of discoveries using these cells, and the family hasn't seen a penny. So I think a book like this really puts into perspective like these cells came from a woman, they came from a real human being, and it's important to know that like where we came from, like have that kind of like human perspective to it, and it's not just like this cell in a dish that's just going to make somebody money someday.
mm.
It's at least I find those things are really important to keep in mind. I find that they help me motivate myself to be like, okay, this is going to help people. This is important rather than this is just a lab
Mm.
experiment.
It kind of takes it from simply just being abstract to something that is very real and the interconnection between the fact that I don't know, the fact that it did come from a real person, I think makes you feel so much more connected with whatever it is that you're doing rather than just like, oh, this is a cell. I think that is one
Yeah.
of the beautiful parts about learning history. It's been a recent change in my life now where I feel like I have fallen in love with history. And it's just because it's so hard to know where we are without knowing how we got here. And to like act as if we
Hmm.
just got here out of chance is, I think, honestly, really wrong. And so to understand all the kind of small decisions that were taken over the span of humanity to get us to where we are today, I think is such a fascinating journey to learn. So I guess like the
Yeah.
last kind of thing I really wanted to talk to you about and just like put a bow tie on this whole conversation, which has been lovely, by the way, is I think something that I honestly find really unfortunate with a lot of people in academia is you can just by all the work that you have to do, the stress that comes out, you can become really tight, I think, as a person. But I think I wasn't, we haven't been able to catch up too much in the last 8, 9 years or so. But I've seen from the outside things that you've been up to, the traveling that you do, the kind of adventures you go on. And it feels like you were able to keep a certain level of free-spiritedness that like typically may not be expected from someone who is an academic and is as highly intelligent in the ways that you are. What has that been like for you to be able to exist in both? I think it ties us back to our original conversation where for you, you were able to embody so many different like cultures and like perspectives as you were growing up that you didn't really have to like be like, I have to be this one. So your
Hmm.
ability to kind of be this free-spirited individual who does all these awesome things, but also be an academic, be at Oxford, to handle both of those, I think is really cool. How have you kind of been able to exist in both worlds?
Yeah. That is, yeah, that's a good point. I think I really developed this ability in undergrad, and I think that had to do with being at UC Berkeley and why I have zero regrets. Or sorry, going to UC Santa Barbara and not picking UC Berkeley, and why I have zero regrets about not picking it because I feel like I was able to flourish in that environment that definitely valued extracurricular life, but also had a very strong emphasis on academics as well. Versus if I were to have gone to Berkeley, I think I would have been somebody that put way more emphasis on my academics and not my social life and extracurricular activities. So I think that's where I really learned this like cliche, but this is definitely something everybody said at UCSB is work hard, play hard. You really do learn that there because I did well in most of my classes or well enough, and I still like really valued hanging out with friends, going to the beach, like everything outside of that. I knew both of those things were important from yeah pretty early on that like in order for me at least personally to be like have to be happy and have like a good mental health state is to just not put myself 100% into one area or the other. So I think that's where I really developed the ability, and that just kind of carried on throughout the rest of my life this far. I do think that I've always loved traveling, and this kind of like goes back to like the love of like learning and experiencing things. I mean, definitely growing up, I was, like I said, I was a very shy child. So experiencing new things was a little scary, and change is always like a little bit scary. Um, but I've always loved learning. I've always been curious. So I think that has like helped me like maintain my passion for academics, but also for like learning things about the world and like other cultures. And last year, I left my job in April, and I was going to move here in September to start my PhD. So I had like a nice solid, like almost 5 month gap in between. And I just went like and solo traveled across Southeast Asia. I went to like Thailand and Cambodia and Bali, Fiji, and Canada for a bit, like kind of just everywhere around the world. And I kind of thought, okay, this is going to be my big travel summer because now I'm going to sign my life away to my PhD for the next 3 to 4 years. But I've still found, especially this summer, that I mean, it obviously helps that I live in Europe now, and like Amsterdam is literally a 45-minute flight, or like all of Europe is like very accessible. So I've found time on the weekends, um, yeah, just to take some time for myself, go explore a new country, do something new. I think that's very important. Like for not only me, but for most people, you cannot be 100% academics. Like you need to take time for yourself. And it's not only just like for you, but then I think your research or work benefits as well, because then you can just like come back with like a fresher mind, fresher eyes on something. Like my PI
Mm.
told me when I joined the lab, and I think this is a big cultural difference between Americans and Europeans, is that us Americans are like born and bred to be workaholics. It's just like we love working. That's always a priority is your job. And like, we get, at least at my first job, I got 10 days of PTO when I first started. And I remember a couple years into the job, they changed the policy that if you were there for over 2 years, you got 15 days. And you're like, oh, so excited to have those 5 extra days. Like 15 seems reasonable. And I moved here and I asked my PI, what's the vacation situation or holiday as it's called here? He's like, oh, well, I don't take too much holiday, like 6 weeks probably. I was like, 6 weeks? That's like double what I thought was good before. So I think that's also really helped is like kind of getting out of that American workaholic mindset and into the like your more European mindset of like it's normal, it's good to take breaks, it's good to travel and take time for yourself. But at the same time, like yeah, I said, I'd rather you take your 6 weeks in kind of like big chunks than take like a week every month or something like that, where just so you are able to build like a flow with yourself and your research
Mm.
so that you're not just kind of like constantly going and coming. It's definitely important to be consistent. Um, but yeah, it's just, I don't know, I guess something that I've always kind of carried. And I think especially moving here, has reaffirmed my feelings about it being important to maintain high motivation in your work and being thorough, but also knowing when it's time to take a break for yourself.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important process because it keeps the spark going as well. Otherwise, it'll be burnt out,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't really move in any direction. And I think that ability to keep that fire going, no matter what it is, because in my opinion, that fire is curiosity, and so to keep that going, you have to take care of it to make sure it never gets smothered. And I think taking a break, traveling, seeing other people who look at the world differently, who care about different things, I think really always helps with that perspective and keep that curiosity going. But, I just wanted to say in general, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like there's so much more that we could have talked about, but I think we were able to get a really good. I wanted to capture the transformation of how Fremont has impacted you as a person and how that kind of carried over to you balancing this really unique lifestyle of being an academic and being able to be so free-spirited and in the world. And I think it was a really beautiful journey you were able to draw out for us. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me and just like providing the groundwork to talk about all these things because I definitely have these like thoughts in my head from time to time, but it's good to just kind of lay everything out and especially going back to Forest Park. Like I would not have remembered a lot of those things if we didn't like spark this conversation. So yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and you say you had a hard time with oral presentations, but I feel like now you kill it.
Yeah, no, yeah, I don't know if it's growing up or what, but I definitely feel like I'm a lot less shy now as a person.
What would
So
Mr. Iwata
maybe
say?
I have to thank Mr. Wada
Yeah.
for
Well, that's great.
exposure therapy.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.